All right, let's get to Revelation chapter 18, bottom of page 220. Verse 21 is where we will be. I'll read verse 21 through 24. Again, just 4 verses tonight. We will end early, but who knows what we'll get into as we walk through that. Let me read it. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore. No craftsman or any craft shall be found in you anymore, and the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore, and the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth," and sort of a transition here, "for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived, and in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all who were slain on the earth." So, of course, we've talked about this since chapter 16. We are looking at the future judgment of a place or a people known as Babylon here. That name describes the people that are following the Antichrist, the false prophet, and essentially worshiping Satan at this time. They hate God, they hate the gospel. They have actively persecuted Christians. By this time, they've actually actively been a part of murdering Christians, and the Christians have been martyred by the time we are here. We've seen even in chapter 18, and certainly in 17, how the timing and the chronology is not always so smooth. So whatever you take away, remember when you come into the seals and bowls and trumpets of the book of Revelation, it's not as simply chronological as you would like, right? It's not that simple. There are times where, like we saw in Genesis 1 and 2, where something is described and then we back up and describe the same thing in a different way or a fuller way or with a word picture, as we'll see tonight. Here we're looking sort of at what was described in what we talked about last week. If you go back to chapter 18, verse number 9, you'll see the kings of the earth. That was the first group. Verse 11, the merchants, that was the second group. Verse 17, the shipmasters and those who travel or trade on sea. Those 3 groups of people, we saw their response to the same event, the destruction of Babylon. But notice how it was described in verse 10. "For in 1 hour your judgment has come." That was verse number 10. "In 1 hour your judgment has come." Go to verse number 17. "For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing." And then the end of verse 19, "For in 1 hour she's made desolate." Verse 21 provides us an illustration, sort of in word picture form, of what it means to talk about the destruction of Babylon as being instantaneous. And to do that, we're introduced to another individual. In fact, John is. John is met with another character described as a mighty angel. Now, we've already seen this. If my memory serves me, it's 5:2. Go back to Revelation 5:2. We've already met a strong angel. Don't know if it's the same one. Verse 2, "Then I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to open the scroll and loose its seals?'" And then chapter 10, verse 1. I believe that's right. Chapter 10, verse 1. "I saw still another mighty angel coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud." So here, going back to verse 21, we have "then a mighty angel." We don't have "then that mighty angel" we saw before. We have every reason to believe this is another angel. And one thing I've pointed out, a lot of these angels have existed for all eternity for this one purpose. Perhaps they had some other ministry leading up to this and in glorifying God, but their main job, their one purpose in all of their existence is this. Well, this particular angel's job is significant. It is to symbolically describe to John what it means to say that Babylon will be destroyed in an hour. And how does he do it? Well, he's called a mighty angel. That word there actually is very important. It's instructive. It tells us this angel is like John Bunyan. In fact, one commentator has described it that way, a Bunyan-esque angel. This is a massive angel in our minds based on what this angel is going to do. "Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone." So it wasn't a millstone. It was a stone like a millstone. So what's a millstone, right? Well, you ever go to, in a lot of cases you'll see it in a Mexican restaurant, but at some other restaurants as well, they might be offering you the opportunity to see them make a dip or something or spices in front of you, and they'll take that little stone bowl and pound it with that pestle deal and just crush it all up. Well, something like that, only primarily used to grind wheat, was called a millstone. And it came in a bunch of different versions. Some that were handheld, where a mother, or a father, a woman, a man could use it personally to prepare grain to make something for their family. Or in other cases, it was used for the whole town. And they were so big, they were thousands of pounds. And we found these exist. Thousands of pounds, and they had to be turned by oxen, by large donkeys, by beasts of burden. I mean, this is heavy stuff. That is what is being described here. When he says the angel, this mighty angel, took up a stone like a great millstone, he means one of the big ones. So we have this picture here. John has just heard the response of the merchants, of the kings of the earth, and of these seafaring people to the destruction of Babylon. And now the scene shifts, and the mighty angel picks up this giant boulder. That's what he sees. He's got this giant boulder in his hands over his head, and he does something with it. He threw it into the sea. Now, every guy here has enjoyed at some point in their life, and perhaps the gals as well, throwing rocks, especially into water. It's fun. I still enjoy it today. Can't explain it, but it's fun. And what's really fun is to throw a big rock into the water. And you enjoy doing that because it makes a big splash. It, ruffles the water. It's just fun, right? I have shown all my kids the joy of throwing rocks into water. Well, think about what would happen if a giant rock of thousands of pounds was thrown into the sea. What are the things that you think would happen? Big waves. What else? What? It's going to sink. Would it sink slowly? It's going to sink pretty quick, right? And you don't want to get in between the bottom and that rock, right? It's going to sink quickly. So there's something significant there. Heavy stone thrown into the ocean, sinks quick. And is it going to float back up? So again, the Bible is written in such a way, the Lord wants us to understand it. This imagery, if you think about it, is very simple. Something that's likened to a giant stone throwing into the ocean is something that is going to be irreversibly judged. That's the imagery here. That stone's not floating back up. Listen to what he says. Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found anymore. Doesn't that sound like some other stories in the Bible? What is another city that you could use that kind of language to describe what happened in the Bible? Thrown down. Shout it out. Sodom and Gomorrah, absolutely. I'll talk about that one Sunday in the archaeological evidence. Maybe you don't understand what has actually been located in regard to that. What's the other one? Well, Jericho. That'll also be commented on Sunday, Lord willing. Jericho. So let's just take Sodom and Gomorrah and Jericho. Both of those are described as kingdoms that were, boom, brought down instantly, right? So those, together with the imagery of this rock, tell us what's going to happen. But remember what we're talking about. We're talking about the whole world that's come together in this alliance. We've seen that. That's not coming from a system. That's right here in the Scriptures. The whole world is unified in their hatred of God, with the exception of the Christians, and all of them, the whole thing, crashes. Now that's interesting because, as I said last week, man sort of believes in this sort of invincibility that comes with the technological advancements of our day. We feel like we're beyond those days where those things could happen. But a day is coming. A day is coming where these things will happen with great violence. Look at that language there, with violence. We talked about that before. The violence describes the way in which individuals will be personally judged. They'll be personally judged, but not killed forever, because they're going to be punished forever, but they're going to be personally judged in sort of an equal way with which they've executed violence on Christians. We'll get to that in the last verse. But he says, thus with violence, verse 21, the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found anymore. Think about that. Shall not be found anymore. That means there's not going to be a future trace of it. No, there's not going to be an archaeological dig after this that's going to find it. It's going to be destroyed. That's why it'll never be found anymore. It's no longer going to exist. This gets at the heart of the severity of the judgment that's coming upon the world that opposes God. And that's the easiest way to put it. Then verse 22 and 23 work together, except the end of verse 23. They're very simple. The angel is still talking, and for whatever reason, the Lord chose to give us an illustration of what it will look like in terms of the rapid change in lifestyle that those in the world will experience. Look at the way he gives these categories. The sounds of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpets shall not be heard in you anymore. So just think about that for a second. How could you say that simply? What does that sound like? Right? But now we're talking about music. So what does that mean? There's not going to be any more music. Now, why would that be significant? Well, so that's an interesting approach. Music is joyful, and there's a lot of examples in the Bible of music being used to rejoice. But remember, that's true, but all these people hate God. So there's also examples in the book of Isaiah of music being indicative of revelry and debauchery and used to celebrate that. And I think the idea here is that all of the celebrating of sin will end. It's all over. So, pop quiz. Does the world celebrate sin today? It does. Will they celebrate sin in the future? They will not. That's, I think, what we're looking at here with this music. It's interesting, though, because he's describing a very common practice. Harpists, musicians, flutists, trumpets, they were not fearful of God. There is no fear of God in their eyes. They are absolutely content and joyful in their sinful rebellion against God, but that will come to an end. Look at the next category. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore. No craftsman of any craft. So this is a picture of just the general industry of life coming to a close. It's interesting because when I was looking at this, it almost sounds like we're talking about the merchants that were described as responding to Babylon's destruction, that were profiting from these people, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the actual craftsmen within Babylon, the capital city, as it were, of the center of Antichrist rule in that age. Their ability or their practice of making money and furthering their rebellion against God will also come to an end. And look at this next one. I found this interesting to use this same word in a different way. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. This is more akin to someone in the home using a millstone to grind out flour to make a meal. All that's going to end. There's not going to be any more joy over your sin, rejoicing and celebrating it. There's not going to be any more sort of duplication of your sin through profiting. And there's not going to be any more resting in daily life. It's all going to come to a close. It's all going to come to a close. He says in verse 23, adding to this list, the light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore. Now, how were lamps lit in those days? Oil. So this is simple. How would light not be able to be lit anymore if there's no oil? So the idea here is that even your resources, if you depended upon for all this time, will be depleted. They will be removed. This next one will get you. And the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. So what does that sound like? One commentator wrote this. I thought this was a little, borderline sappy, borderline nonsense, borderline heresy, but said that love will die. I don't even know what that means, but the bottom line here is the common practice of people just going on their life living without God will end. There'll be no more marriages. Now, we already knew that about heaven, though, right? You know that, right? You realize that, right? Everyone knows that. There's no marrying or being married in heaven. We're all essentially, in that sense, married to Christ. You get that, right? Well, that means that this shouldn't be a shock. So it's not just the ending of marriage, because that almost sounds like, well, hold on. Let me not say that. I was going to say that almost sounds like heaven. That's not what I meant. What I mean is it almost sounds like the story of heaven in that there'll be no marrying, but that's not how I meant for it to come out. You understand what I'm saying? It stays right in here, right? So here's the idea behind what I was saying. The idea is that doesn't sound negative. That sounds like a biblical positive. But the idea here is not just merely marriage, but there'll be no more going on in life without God. Because biblically speaking, marriage is something that exists before God and with God at the center, right? But how many marriages in Babylon have God at the center? 0. So that's over. God's going to end that. The next one. For your merchants were the great men of the earth. Now, this is actually almost sarcastic, because the idea here is not the angel saying, your merchants were these great and mighty men. Rather, they were arrogant. He, in this section, transitions and begins to give some reasons why they're being judged. Now, that's really what we saw in 17 and 18, but now we're going to get 3 more reasons why they're going to be judged. Their arrogance. They were the mighty men. They were arrogant. The Bible is very, very important about us being cautious, to take heed, thinking that we will stand forever, because we could easily fall or be brought down. But the next one here says, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. Now remember, go back up to verse number 9. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep. The kings of the earth. Verse number 3 of chapter 18. It says, for all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now I could keep going with examples, but the idea is this. Babylon will influence the world, but it won't just merely be human or fleshly. This will be satanic. Satan will be the prime influencer behind the deception of the world. This great deception that's coming, which you can say that, will be inspired and empowered by Satan. Because we often think, well, people are not going to fall for these things. Hold on. Now you're talking as if God does not exist and Satan does not have power under God's sovereign control. He does. And in this day, this can be attributed to the deception of the world, that is, the sorcery of the nation. So in this way, they're being judged. This is the second reason. They're being judged because of the way they have wickedly partnered with Satan. They have wickedly profited from Satan, and they have made themselves guilty by deceiving people. The scriptures are very clear. In fact, think of what Jesus said about a millstone. What did Jesus say about a millstone and about leading someone astray? So, Barbara, that's exactly right. It would be better if you were just instantly killed. And the idea there is because there's going to be a significant judgment for you that is much worse than being instantly killed. If you're guilty of leading someone astray. In that text, it's the little ones, but the idea of deceiving people and leading them astray in the Bible is very serious. And this is something that has to be very carefully considered, and that is what they're guilty of. In the last verse, verse 23, he gives the final reason, and in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all who were slain on the earth. I give some quotes in here from Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51, 61, and 64 provide a backdrop to this element of Babylon's judgment, but I wanted you to be able to read that at home. But I wanted to consider this idea. What you're seeing here in verse 24 is the idea of the blood of these saints crying out for vengeance. Turn back to Revelation 6, verse number 10. Revelation 6, verse number 10. I want you to see this. From the beginning to the end of the Bible, the blood of innocent people cries out for the vengeance of God upon their fate. Look at chapter 6, verse 10. And they cried, right? These are those that are martyred under the 5th seal. They cried with a loud voice saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Well, our verse is the when. That's when their blood is avenged. Because the third reason Babylon's being judged in our section is because the blood of the prophets is there. And it's crying out. You know where that came from, though? Where's the first mention in the Bible of that idea? Cain and Abel. You either read ahead or you know your Bible well. Let's go back and we'll look in Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, and listen to what is said here about Cain and Abel. Actually, the Lord speaking to Cain in verse 9 of Genesis 4. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. It's a fearful thing to lie to God's face, by the way. Am I my brother's keeper? More on that in a minute. Verse 10. And he said, this is God, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me, not to someone else, to me from the ground. This is the idea behind the destruction of Babylon, because the voice of the blood of many, 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 many martyrs, all the Christians that are alive in that day, their blood will cry out to God. And according to Revelation 6:10, God will avenge their death by bringing judgment, final judgment upon these people. Go back to verse number 9, though, of Genesis 4. The question Cain asks is such an important question. He asks it like your child would ask, in a sarcastic way right before they got in trouble. Am I my brother's keeper? And the rest of the Bible goes on to answer that question. Because through the rest of the Bible, we learn the answer to that question is, yes, we absolutely are our brother's keeper. We're not responsible for our brother's sin, though we can lead them into temptation. We're not responsible for our brother's suffering and solving all of their problems per se, but we are our brother's keeper. We have a direct responsibility to care for one another. You've ever heard us talk about that? I don't know. Maybe we have a few times. This is the missing element of Christianity in the modern church. Every individual experience of Christianity is at best a half experience of Christianity. It's at best half of what Jesus died to provide for us. And so when we walk through this life, and by the way, fear or pride, and fear is just pride coming in the back door, fear or pride are always the reason why we insist on living privately and sort of secluding our lives and concealing reality. And the church is weaker for it. All of us are. All of us are weaker as Christians. Or I could say it this way. All of us could stand to gain significantly spiritually, and of course, as a result of that, emotionally and relationally, etc., by honest ministry with one another. But what do we often hear about Christians? We often hear they're one thing at church, but they're another thing when they're away. What is that? Well, that's pretending. That's pretending to be something that we're not. This has nothing to do with Revelation 19, but I told you we might get into something else, and now we have. It has nothing to do with Revelation 19 or 18. But this idea of us thinking that we are individually related to God fails to understand the simple message of the gospel. I see this constantly on the internet. I see this constantly in our world today of people saying this, well, I just interpret the Bible differently. This mindset is so incredible when it's coming from a professing Christian's mouth. Because the scriptures either have one clear meaning and multiple applications, or you have to understand they have no clear meaning. If Jesus' words meant whatever we or whatever generation seeks to interpret him thinks he meant, they mean nothing. When Jesus says, my word is truth, he did not say or mean your understanding in your own individual heart and mind is truth. His word is truth. This is why the Apostle Paul tells us we must labor. This is what Awana stands for. We must labor to be workmen approved, rightly dividing the word of truth. Because if we don't rightly divide it, we do what? We wrongly divide it. And what's the first part of that verse? Study so you're not ashamed. The church has removed the idea of shame for wrongly dividing the word of Christ. And we're afraid to say that's wrong. And now you go on the internet and you'll see people that, a lot of the major Christian institutions and organizations that you and I have supported for 50 years have lost their entire mind and lost the gospel. And I'd love to name off about 10 of them right now. And maybe you used to give money to these people. But these people don't believe what I believe anymore, what the Bible teaches anymore. They believe what the world's version of Christianity believes. This is an important point. The idea of us being secluded Christians and living the secluded Christian life comes from this individualistic idea that I believe has to be crushed in the church. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But it has to be crushed. You and I suffer already because we live in a fallen world marked by the fall. We exacerbate our suffering when we do it alone. Does anyone here enjoy suffering? Well, how do you like suffering beyond what you needed to suffer? It's terrible. And yet when we isolate ourselves, that's what happens. So how do we respond to that? Well, we respond to that by developing meaningful relationships in the church. And of course, I'm preaching to the choir because most all of you have those things. But maybe some of you don't, and maybe some of you watching at home or wherever you're watching this from don't either. Every Christian needs to have someone in their life in the local church. This is another thing, the decentralization of, oh my goodness, there's so much to talk about that. But you need to have someone in your life that knows you and knows your temptations, knows how you fail, knows how you sin, and is praying for you. Not someone, by the way, that just is a yes man to you and lets you get away with whatever. Someone who's willing to challenge you and call you on your sin, selfishness, pride, or failure, or lack of following through and commitment, or failure to follow in the spiritual disciplines. You need people in your life that do that. And then we have to be open to receive that. It's only pride that keeps us from receiving that, right? You say, well, Mark, I've got my spouse. Well, if you genuinely have that kind of relationship with your spouse, that's wonderful. But I still think you need to have more because Christ gave you the church, not just your spouse. There should be other people in your life. That's, by the way, why we tell people to go to small groups. People think, well, why do I have to go to hear another Bible lesson? Well, it's not just another Bible lesson, right? It's you getting involved in a community of people that can help you grow to be more like Jesus Christ. And not just by having parties all the time. That's not it either. And not just by having friendships. If in the course of the friendships you're developing, you're not talking about Jesus, that's not fellowship. That's friendship. In your conversations, you got to be talking about Jesus. And part of the reason we struggle, by the way, and I think I'm going to roll now, part of the reason we struggle to share the gospel and it's so uncomfortable is because we don't even talk about Christ with Christians. And so it's super weird to talk about it with non-Christians because we don't even have that experience with each other. We should feel free to talk about Jesus with each other, right? Can you talk about other things? Of course you can, and I would encourage that, and that's fantastic. But we should be talking about Christ. And fathers and grandfathers and mothers, talk about it in the home with your kids. If you don't talk about Christ in the home with your kids and you expect your kids to talk about Christ, boy, oh boy, the likelihood of that is low. But talk about Christ in the home, and you'll begin to develop this. This is one of the things that I've tried to do with my kids, and albeit I've not done it very well at times, is help them understand, because this is a weird thing for them. Their whole life I've been a pastor. Their whole life I've had these massive numbers of people that look to me to give them the spiritual leadership, and it's weird for them at home because they see me, and understand what I mean, but they see me sort of like on the top of the pile. And they don't understand that I have to be under authority and this accountability too. So I try to communicate to them that there are people in my life that I'm turning to for wisdom, and people that are willing to rebuke me and encourage me and direct me. And I'll often say, well, you know, I talk with Pastor Jeff, or I talk with Brother Charles, or talk to so-and-so, or one of my deacons, and they said this, and I think we should pray about this. And by doing that before my kids, they're like, okay, wait a minute, it's Dad too. It's even the pastor and the pastor's kids. So this is a critical element that comes out of that little text. Am I my brother's keeper? We are. And for you and I that are thinking about what this fate will be for those in Babylon, there's a tremendous amount of application for that as well. Because there's a possibility this could be us. Right? I think there is. I mean, your system may be different, but in my system, I think it's possible. This could be us. And how much more will we need each other if we're in some situation like that? So it'd be wonderful for us to develop these strong friendships now when it's not difficult, right? One of the things I ask the pastors to do is to have people in their home every week if possible, at least every month, regularly having folks over, developing relationships and friendships. And I would encourage that to you as well, people from the church. Spend time with folks from the church and talk about Christ. One of the things that we try to do is when we have someone over, if they have kids, we'll, at the end of the evening, we'll try to have them stay until this time. We'll get all their kids together with our kids, and we'll do family worship like we've done every night now for 19 years in my home. My son just turned 19. And we'll invite them to partake in it, and then we'll give them, Michelle keeps a stack of resources to give away. We'll give them a book and say, now you go and do the same. and then we'll keep up with them, encourage them. And you could do something like that too. I've heard of that, of different, some of you brothers in here, going to lunch with guys and taking them under your wing and beginning to teach them the Bible and teach them doctrine, or some of the ladies with younger ladies doing the same thing. This is the real heart of the church. We have to throw out this idea that the church is just a place of religious entertainment that exists to make us feel good. We are a family, and we have to grow in our understanding of who Christ is and grow closer to each other, all right? This is critical, especially with the days that are approaching. So that brings us to the end of chapter 18. Chapter 19, I do want to sort of whet your appetite, because if you look at verse number 7, you'll see what's coming in August. Verse number 7. As soon as I read it, you're going to say, oh, I've heard about that. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. If you remember, when we started chapter 18, I said we're going to come to the end of talking about the destruction of this worldly city, and we're going to start talking about what? The founding and the explosion of a heavenly city. And from here on out, we're going to talk about, with a couple of exceptions, the new heavens, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, and our future eternal home. And there'll be much to rejoice about with that. So I'm going to pray and then hang on for a minute after we're done. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for your kindness and your grace and mercy in giving us insight into the future. We don't know for sure if it's our individual personal future, perhaps our kids or our grandkids. We don't know. Only you do, Lord. But Father, we commit ourselves to you and ask for wisdom and faith and endurance regardless of what we do face. In Jesus' name, amen.